last few decades, thousands of farmers have been introduced to the industrial paradigm of farming. Increasingly, voices are being raised against climate change and other negative side effects of this industrialization, like the recent Skip School Friday strike on the 15th of March 2019. This triggers us to think more holistically about the sustainability of our food system. In this regard, General Mills has recently announced that they plan to regenerate 1 million acres of farmland by 2030 through regenerative farming. Hello everyone, I'm Chaitra Bharath from Agribusiness Academy, and I'm joined on this podcast by Ethan Roland, farmer, entrepreneur, and international expert on regenerative business and agriculture. He is the co-author of Levels of Regenerative Agriculture and Regenerative Enterprise, Optimizing for Multi-Capital Abundance. Ethan has great experience in 34 countries. He is the founder of the Regenerative Enterprise Institute, an associate of the Carol Sanford Institute, and a member of the Regenerative Business Alliance. We also have Debora van Zee, my colleague from Netherlands, who is a nutritionist and consultant specialized in sustainable food production. Welcome to Ethan and Debora.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you very much.
Many in our audience will have heard of the phrase regenerative agriculture. However, they may not be familiar with the details of it. Could you introduce us to the concept of regenerative agriculture and also tell us how it is different from other sustainable forms of agriculture like nature inclusive and organic farming?
Definitely. I think the best way to think about this is to realize that there are many different paradigms of farming, many different worldviews on agriculture and how it can work and what it does in the world. And I want to say that none of these worldviews, these paradigms, are better than one another, but they're very different and they have very different effects in the world. There's 4 primary paradigms that I like to think about and talk about that will help to understand what is regenerative agriculture, that will help to differentiate a regenerative approach from a extractive, from the industrial farming approach that you discussed earlier. So you can sort of think of these 4 paradigms going through time, starting a few hundred years ago and moving up to the present. The first one to think about is extractive agriculture. And in extractive agriculture, the goal is to extract resources from the natural environment and use them for one's own gain. Industrial farming is the pinnacle. It's the top of regenerative or of extractive agriculture. And the Green Revolution that happened starting after World War II is an example of extractive agriculture attempting to get more and more and more out of the land. And it did grow more food, but with dire consequences for the environment and for farming communities, especially across Africa, through India and Asia and in South America. Some people, when doing extractive agriculture, started to realize, wait a minute, this extraction is actually damaging the earth. It's damaging our farm. It's damaging the soil. The soil is eroding away. There's chemicals. We're getting sick. And so they had this idea of, well, let's do something less bad. Let's make sure that we're not just extracting. Let's do something a little better. And so that brings us to what I describe as the next paradigm, which is conservative agriculture. And in conservative agriculture, under which I would put most organic agriculture and most quote unquote sustainable agriculture, the goal is to do less harm. We're using less pesticides, less fertilizers, less chemicals, and seeking to have not as much of an impact, of a negative impact on the earth, on our communities. And so this is the best sense of conservation. It's attempting to conserve resources and do less harm. I think that from there, some farmers, especially the organic farmers who really, as they tried to do less, as they tried to have less inputs, they realized that they might even be able to go beyond conservation. They might be able to go beyond organic. And that for me is where the switch to the next paradigm of agriculture came in. And this is the paradigm that I call net positive. Instead of just trying to do less harm, net positive agriculture aims to do good. It aims to improve the soil. It aims to increase the well-being of the farming community, not just through money, but through health and biodiversity and clean water and good, healthy food. And this was a big step forward, and there's still not enough of this happening. Most agriculture in the world is extractive. The vast majority is extractive. There is some that is conservative, and more, even the large agribusiness companies are moving towards a conservative approach, what they call sustainable. But I don't actually think, I have very rarely seen anything I would call a sustainable agriculture, because all agriculture is still using inputs externally, it's using fossil fuels, it's still degrading the soil somewhat. So there's very little agriculture that has actually achieved sustainability. And I think that the way to achieve sustainability isn't to aim for sustainability, it's to go towards net positive. It's to say, how can I actually do good while I'm farming? How can I build the soil and improve it? None of these three paradigms I've talked about describe regenerative agriculture. So regenerative agriculture is the fourth paradigm, and it's one that is emerging and growing now in the public eye. It also, kind of paradoxically, is a form of agriculture that existed a long time ago. Before industrialization, before extractive agriculture, many peoples all over the world had forms of regenerative agriculture. As it comes back, as it's growing again now, the way to think about it is not just net positive. So it doesn't just build the soil or improve biodiversity, but regenerative agriculture actually improves and evolves the capacity of the farm and the capacity of the whole area, the whole bioregion, the whole river valley where the farm is. It evolves the capacity of that whole system to improve itself, to express its own unique biological fingerprint, to build soil and enhance ecosystems on a large scale. So the shift from net positive to regenerative, one of the shifts is not just that we're getting better soil on our farm, but that we're enhancing the capability of all the farmers in the region and all the communities in the region to evolve the whole ecosystem that they're part of.
That's wonderful. You really gave us a complete picture of what is regenerative agriculture in such few words. That's amazing how you can comprehend everything so well. Thank you so much. So what are the major adaptation challenges for widespread transition to regenerative agriculture? And would there be a difference in approach for farms in upcoming economies?
There are several challenges. The main one, honestly, is in the mind of the farmers and the entrepreneurs. So shifting to regenerative agriculture requires that we change how we think. And that's very difficult. It takes time to do. Instead of thinking about the farm and the inputs and the outputs, you have to think about, where is this farm? What is the larger landscape? What is the larger river valley? What is the long history of this place? How do we create something here that expresses what is unique about this particular place? And I can give some examples of that later on when we talk about my farm here in New York in the United States. So really the challenge is how to shift the mind to think regeneratively. instead of thinking extractively or even thinking, how do I do less harm? So that's one of the biggest challenges. And in many ways, I think that the current global economy that pushes for low cost, high yields, this is a significant challenge. And many times when you shift to regenerative agriculture, especially if it includes certain principles and practices, for example, agroforestry, integrating trees and livestock with agriculture, these systems can actually have greater yields than monoculture industrial farming systems. However, they take some time to establish and start really showing their potential. And so the challenge is, how do farmers, how do businesses support the transition from an economy that is very extractive in its nature? How do we support the transition of farms to regenerative, to complex, diverse, productive ecosystems? And there are a number of approaches to that, but I think a really big one to think about is community and the culture that's surrounding agriculture. And in a lot of ways, farmers working in what I call most of the world, the global majority of the world, that have not been overly industrialized, farmers in those economies have a greater chance at shifting to regenerative agriculture because in many cases, the culture and community of farming is still very intact. And it's important, I think, or I have experience, for regenerative farms to build direct relationships with their local community and then also build relationships with a wider community that can understand and support the movement towards regenerative agriculture.
So, Deborah, do you have any views on this? Would you like to ask Ethan something?
Well, there are two things. One thing is when you actually to respond on what you were just saying. As I understand it well, you say actually for in so-called upcoming economies, it will probably be easier to shift to regenerative agriculture because there's more of a bond between the community and the farm still. At the same time, the current developments are actually going in the direction of like the more extractive agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we kind of stop this and say, well, you need to take a different direction?
Well, there's a really excellent example from India, from the state of Andhra Pradesh, which recently announced a full state shift to something that is probably, towards regenerative agriculture. It's certainly in the net positive realm, but it's definitely on the path to regeneration, that they call zero budget natural farming. And what they found is that through shifting to a system where all of your inputs are generated locally, where you're working with the local community and economy to diversify production and improve the overall ecosystem, they actually figured out how to save the government money. They took out the pesticide and herbicide and chemical fertilizer salespeople and all the subsidies that are going towards that. And they found that they can actually make more money going towards regenerative than they were on the path to extractive. And the other thing with the extractive agriculture is that it very quickly, especially in tropical systems, it very quickly degrades the soil. So you might have some short-term high yields, but that actually destroys the soil, that destroys the ecosystem, and makes it harder for farmers in the midterm and in the long term. And so while there does seem to be a push in many places towards extraction, towards industrialization, The thing about farmers is that they are so brilliant, they are so innovative, and they are so attuned to their farm, to their local and natural environment. And so when given the chance, when invited to use their minds and their knowledge and their connection to the environment, to the natural systems around them, they will often, when given a choice, move in this direction. It's just if we can help out on the economic side of it to make that choice feasible.
But yeah, thank you. That's a really nice elaboration on my question. The other thing that I was thinking of already in the preparations for this conversation is that often when we talk about organic agriculture, which you say, you know, is actually quite a long way from regenerative, is that it said, well, it's all nice, but we have to feed so many people, and we can't do that with these forms of sustainable agriculture. Or
This is a
um,
this is a big mistake. I don't know. This is a belief that is propagated by the industrial agriculture
yeah,
companies because it's absolutely not true. Even with organic agriculture, and even more with net positive and regenerative agriculture, the production actually increases, especially for smallholder farmers, especially for diverse agroecosystems. The food production actually increases, and more than that, the nutrient density of the food increases.
yeah,
So, you know, an industrial corn or millet or rice field, yes, you can get a lot of bushels per acre or kilos per acre, or sorry, kilos per hectare in this case. However, the nutrition is very, very low, and the diversity of nutrition is low. And so when you shift even to organic agriculture, and you know, I'm a big supporter of organic agriculture. I think people should move towards it. I think they should get organic agriculture and then go beyond it. And one of the challenges with organic agriculture is that it is only a practices-based approach. So it only defines what you can or cannot do. It says you can't use chemical pesticides, you can't use chemical fertilizers. But it doesn't focus on the outcomes, right? It doesn't focus on what are the benefits to the ecosystem, what are the improvements in the local communities. And that's a big part of going to regenerative agriculture, is shifting the focus to what are the outcomes that are used instead of, well, what practices am I doing? But overall, the result is higher food production, greater diversity of food, and then higher nutrition for both local food security. And then to top it all off, the food that comes out of regenerative agriculture systems tastes delicious. It is so good. It is so much better flavored than any other systems that are out there. And any chef or anybody who loves food can quickly tell, you know, the quality of taste that is coming out of these systems. So I think we need to, you know, actually check the science, which is more and more proving the points that I'm saying about even organic but net positive and regenerative agriculture outperforming industrial agriculture, especially over the long term, especially in terms of nutrients, but also in terms of quantity, productivity, and yields.
thanks for that, Ethan. It's great for me as a nutritionist to hear this about the nutrition density and the taste of the produce. It's very good news. Maybe to add to that, I would say also people often forget that we need a shift in the dietary patterns as well. And if we combine that with organic or even regenerative agriculture, then you know we can do great things for the feeding the world.
Absolutely. And it's also good to remember that, again, the world already produces more than enough food in terms of calories to feed everybody on the earth. The main issue is the structural inequality and the economic system that doesn't distribute food equitably to the people in the world who need it. And to your point of diets, you know, the overconsumption of meat especially in the over-industrialized world, like in the United States where I live, has a significantly negative impact on the ability of the world to feed itself. I am not a proponent of vegan agriculture per se. I find that animals integrated into the system are extremely important and valuable, and have a huge role to play in nutrient cycling and improving the overall health of the ecosystem. But overall, eating less meat in many cases, in many places in the world, can be beneficial. Nutrient-wise, it's great to have animal fat and animal-based fats, especially, and proteins in the diet, especially if they're coming from a regenerative agriculture system where the animals are eating a diversity of annual and perennial plants and forages. That's really good, high-quality nutrients.
Ethan, so can you introduce us to the 4 levels of regenerative agriculture?
Definitely. This is going to get even deeper and geekier than we've been so far. This is when, it's a big step to move through the different paradigms and start to go towards regenerative. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of what is currently being called regenerative agriculture out in the world and being promoted as regenerative is not actually achieving regeneration. There's sort of a hype right now, which is good. I'm excited that people are excited about it. But most of what's happening is conservative, maybe a little bit of net positive, but very, very few agriculture systems, very, very few farms have actually stepped into the realm of deeply regenerative agriculture. And so this framework that I'll just describe briefly, and then for those who really want to dig in and figure out how to evolve their system within regenerative agriculture, there's a paper that I've written that describes it and gives some principles and examples of how to do it. But briefly, within regenerative agriculture, there are 4 different levels that we've identified. And so the 4 levels are functional, integrative, systemic, and evolutionary. And I'll just talk briefly about each one. Functional regenerative agriculture is really just focused on improving and developing the soil, the water, the ecosystem. It uses best practices and has this idea that humans can do good. Another big part often is to work to reverse climate change, to capture enough carbon in the soil and in the biomass of the trees especially, to fight back against a global overabundance of carbon in the atmosphere. So that is a real promise of even basic functional regenerative agriculture, is to work against climate change. At the same time, capturing carbon, putting it in the soil, makes the soil healthier, makes it hold nutrients better, makes it hold water better, so that's a win-win for farmers. The next level of regenerative agriculture is integrative. And in integrative, we use design thinking and carbon farming practices to look beyond just regenerating the soil and think about, how do we regenerate the whole ecosystem here? How do we turn Earth into a garden of Eden, into a garden of abundance? And how do we use human brilliance, human thinking, and creativity to design a whole farm system that integrates water and animals and trees and houses and humanure and renewable energy and make it into one whole functioning integrated system? That's what happens at the integrative level of regenerative agriculture. To step to the next one, which is systemic, all of a sudden here, now we're looking up to the whole system. This is what I spoke about earlier, where regenerative agriculture looks at the whole bioregion, the whole river valley or watershed in which the farm is growing. And instead of just trying to regenerate the soil or regenerate the ecosystem, at this level, we start thinking about, what is the ecosystem of businesses? What are the ecosystem of enterprises that work together in order to develop regenerative agriculture in a place. So this is beyond just the farm. This is what are the food producers, who are the chefs, who makes the compost, who does the distribution of the food, what are the restaurants, who are the investors, how are we investing multiple forms of capital into evolving the ecosystem of regenerative agriculture in a region. Finally, the fourth level of regenerative agriculture, which is called evolutionary, really goes to the level of culture. And it says, what is the culture of this place? What is the history of this place? How do we weave together the ancient agricultural and horticultural traditions and turn agriculture from something separate, right? Agriculture is like, oh, some people are farmers, some people aren't. How do we transform agriculture so that it is culture? It is a part of culture. It is a ritual of everyday life and ceremony and celebration for everyone in the region, is somehow deeply connected to the agriculture, the farming, the story, the music of the place. And then from there, you don't just have a regenerative enterprise ecosystem, which you have at the systemic level, but there you get into this sense of a regenerative producer web, where this is the opposite of what they call a supply chain, right? You hear this term, the global supply chain, and that's a terrible term for a couple of reasons. One, there are no chains in nature. Two, it's a mechanical metaphor, which means that you're thinking about the earth as a machine, or the land as a machine, which it is not. And three, the term supply chain came from a colonial era when colonial countries actually enslaved people and put them in chains in order to produce agricultural goods to extract value and improve their own financial well-being. So for all those reasons, we don't use the term supply chain. If you ever hear somebody talking about regenerative agriculture in their supply chain, you can be sure that they don't actually fully understand regenerative agriculture, because they're still thinking like a machine. They're still thinking in an older way and not actually bringing the regenerative paradigm into how they approach things and not just what they do on the ground. So to wrap this up, at the evolutionary level of regenerative agriculture, you're working with the 7 principles of regenerative agriculture, which I lay out in my paper, and you're creating regenerative producer webs where everybody is producing something in an interconnected web to feed agriculture as a whole in the community and in the place.
Right. So that's a new one, that we cannot use the term supply chain management or supply chain and regenerative farming. That's very deep. And coming from India, which was colonized by the British for more than 200 years, I can relate to that now. Right. Yeah. So how do you think this framework should stimulate our critical thinking about the future of agriculture?
I really use this as primarily as a self-assessment tool. One of the other concepts from the regenerative paradigm is that it doesn't work to give feedback. Feedback also doesn't exist in natural systems, and it's not an effective way to evolve farming. This is also why, in general, I'm not a huge fan of standards and certifications, because it's an external force that's defining what organic is, and then you have to abide by that. So I love using this framework as a self-assessment tool for myself as a farmer, and then for other farmers. I don't go to a farm and say, oh, well, you're not doing regenerative agriculture, or you're only at level 1, and you should do this, that, and the other thing. No, that's terrible. That's colonialism again, right? That's me thinking that I know better and telling a farmer what she or he should do. So what I do is I lay out this framework and I say, okay, here's this framework. Where do you think you are right now? Where are you working? And where would you like to be working? And what could you do to move yourself from where you currently are to where you want to be? And if you want help along the way, sure, you can ask me for help and I'll see how I can help. But the key is that it's a self-assessment tool that every farm, that every region gets to use to improve themselves, to have personal agency, to develop their own farming, their own agriculture towards what they want. And I don't even believe that the top one, quote unquote, is best, or that regenerative agriculture is better than net positive. I just come in and say, here's this framework. Where do you think you currently are? Where do you want to be? What could you do to get there?
Yeah, it's very interesting when you were saying about the standards and the certifications, and you said, well, I'm not a huge fan of it, which I can understand, as they can be very restrictive and not very innovative in a way. At the same time, working with food producers who want to sell their produce or their products to retailers, and also want to know what suppliers to choose, certifications are often very helpful in communicating. So I'm wondering how you would advise to go about then communicating to the retailer, or in the end, actually the consumer, about the regenerative agriculture, and also not being told that, well, it's just you saying you're doing well, but how can you prove it? And you know, the trust issue is often a problem as well.
Definitely. Yeah. A couple different thoughts on this. So the trust is needed. The trust that certifications offer, to the extent that they do offer it, though there has been some erosion of trust recently, even in the certifications and standard. For example, you know, there's been some issues in certified organic soybeans coming from China into the United States that have found out, oh, they're actually not organic, and that erodes trust in the whole system. And unfortunately, that will often happen when you have certifications, because somebody will always see an economic benefit to circumventing or gaming the system. And that's part of the challenge with certifications. But trust is needed when you get to a certain scale of global agriculture. And ideally, I think how most of food was produced for most of all human history was very, very highly local. And when I live in a community with a farmer, I don't need them to pay for certification. I just visit their farm and I know them and I know what they do and can see that and can see the effects on their farm and their ecosystem. And I can make choices and decisions about, you know, who to purchase from. So certifications become necessary when you get to a certain scale. And even in a little bit larger regional scale, I think there are some really good participatory certification schemes that are farmers, you know, supporting and holding each other accountable to improve their practices and ecosystems. I think those can work really well. But yeah, when you get to a global scale, sometimes it's necessary. That certified organic seal will bring a higher price in the marketplace. And so I recognize that and support that, and actually I'm happy to see the growth of that. However, I would like it very much if certification schemes would begin focusing on outcomes rather than practices. And that has begun to happen this year, especially. There's 2 new certifications that have been released. One is called Land to Market, and that is from the Savory Institute. And that is an outcomes-based ecological verification system that I think has a lot of promise for tracking the actual ecological outcomes and not specifically the practices. And then there's another standard which has just been released for draft comment, for public comments, that is called the Soil Carbon Initiative. And that is a very heavily soil-focused, outcomes-based system that is designed for everyone and anyone to be able to use at a, you know, low-tech version and a high-tech version. But again, it's based on actual outcomes in soil health. So I think that's a really positive movement for certifications, is to move towards outcomes tracking rather than practices.
Thank you for that, Ethan. Very interesting also to hear about these developments on outcomes-based certifications. I wasn't aware of that yet, so thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
So now, Ethan, could you please tell us more about your personal experience with regenerative farming?
Sure, yeah. So I have a couple different angles I can talk about this from. One is my farm, which is a very small farm, High Falls Farm in upstate New York in the United States, about 2 hours from New York City in River Valley called the Hudson River Valley. But I think maybe before I talk about that, I'll start a little earlier and name some of the other farms and agriculture ecosystems that I've experienced and been a part of that have really been formative for me in understanding how regenerative agriculture can work and can be economically very attractive and viable, as well as ecosystem impacts. One place that is very amazing to understand and learn from, I got to visit when I finished university, and that is in Kazakhstan in Central Asia, at the foothills of the Tian Shan Mountains. There is an ancient regenerative agriculture system that has not actually been managed or cared for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But the system itself was so resilient and so well designed that it persists to this day. And these are the wild apple forests of Kazakhstan and also Kyrgyzstan. And these forests are the domestic, or are the origin of all apples in the world. All apples in the world, all big eating apples that you see, they all came from this very biodiverse area in southeastern Kazakhstan and in the mountains of Kyrgyzstan. And it's
Wow.
literally a wild forest with 20-meter tall trees that the trees are apples. And every single apple is a different variety. So there's a red one next to a yellow one, next to a green, next to a orange, next to a pink. They all have different flavors. And then there's a diversity of other food and medicine plants growing wild with the apple trees. So there are strawberries growing on the ground, there's licorice, there's grapevines that climb up through the trees, there are pear trees nearby. Sometimes the apples are mixed with walnut trees. There's raspberries and bilberries and other kinds of berries growing underneath the trees. It's a super diverse agroforestry system, a food forest, essentially. And I believe it was consciously developed by a indigenous community that lived in the mountains for a very long time and developed this unbelievable system of food forestry regenerative agriculture. And so, when I was in Kazakhstan, I was visiting these forests, and right next to the forest, right down the mountain, there was a huge industrial monoculture apple where there are airplanes flying over spraying pesticides, and the fruit was kind of tasteless and poisonous, and I was just looking at these two things right next to each other, saying, why would we do this extractive industrial side of things when we can have a mega diverse polyculture food forest agroecosystem? So I think that was a very formative experience for me. I also got to see and visit a couple different farms, one in the tropics and another one here in the United States. The one in the tropics is actually a cooperative of chocolate, of cacao producers in Ecuador. And they are on the path towards regenerative agriculture through growing cacao and actually working with the international markets. They have connected with companies in the United States and elsewhere who are excited about the regenerative agroforestry work they're doing to grow their cacao. Cacao usually can be, usually industrially is grown in full sun with these hybrid varieties that are high yielding but low flavor. And in this community in northwestern Ecuador, it's a cooperative called Eco Cacao. That's part of a larger cooperative. And they are doing agroforestry growing, shade-grown cacao interplanting other useful and edible vines and trees, coconut palm and turmeric and other spices in the understory, and doing all this amazing work to improve their community. And they've been able to connect with international buyers who see this, they support it, they tell the story of it in order to improve their position in the marketplace, but then also to be able to have premium prices on their product that goes back to supporting the improvement of the ecosystem and of the culture and community. So this is a great example of sort of global trade being very effective in supporting cooperatives of regenerative agriculture practitioners in somewhere, in a tropical place in the world. And I think that is a real key, getting smallholder farmers, regenerative agriculture farmers who are on a small scale to band together into producer cooperatives that can aggregate goods and be able to receive a higher price, but also get the volumes that might be needed for international or even more national trade. And then I guess the last place I'll talk about is a farm that is in Virginia in the United States that's called Polyface Farm, the farm of many faces. And this is an animal-based farm focused on livestock, on beef and chicken and pigs, and growing grass and growing forests that can feed the livestock very effectively. And this is just an amazing example of what can happen when you work well with animals on a farm. They have improved the topsoil significantly. They have built carbon. They've used their excess, their profits each year to invest in more water works on the farm, more ponds, more biodiversity in terms of trees, improving the forest so that they're actually harvesting usable timber for building for themselves, also to sell it. And in doing that, improving the quality of the forest, running the animals through the forest so that they're adding more manure and fertilizer to the system, managing the animals on the grasses so that they improve the grass every time they go through it instead of degrading it. This is an incredible example that's very well described and written up. There's actually a video called Polyfaces, produced by a group called the Regenerative. That's a really excellent group that's working towards regenerative agriculture. Actually, they have some really good training programs for developing your site, your farm, towards regeneration using the different principles of permaculture and carbon farming. So they have a video, Regenerative, the organization Regenerative, they have a video about this farm, Polyfaces, that's really excellent and worth seeing. So and it's a family farm, and their family is the one that runs it, and they are making really good livings for themselves while improving the ecosystem, and then also training more farmers. They have apprenticeship programs, so they're training more farmers that then go out and start their own versions. They learn from what they got at Polyface and create their own unique versions of it elsewhere in the region. So these are just a couple examples of the regenerative agriculture systems I've gotten to visit and see. And then I've also helped to design and support the creation of regenerative agriculture in many countries all over the world, including in Kazakhstan and in Thailand, in Barbados. There's a project I worked on that is taking an old sand mine. It's a place where the sand was mined out for various industrial purposes on the island, and then converting it through a regenerative design process into a biodiverse agroforestry farm system, so that the place where so much damage was done to the land is now transforming so that it produces food and education and wildlife habitat for the local community. And that's when there's also a good website you can see that's called Walker's Reserve on the island of Barbados. So you can learn more about that there.
That's great, Ethan, and especially the food forest from Kazakhstan really sounds like Adam's Eden Garden. As you said,
Well,
what regenerative
right,
farming should go.
right. Right. Well, and I think
Yeah,
they would say there that, you know, sometimes I don't use the term Eden because it's a very Christian concept, and you know, I don't think that's necessarily the right concept all the time. And the people in Kazakhstan, they know that it was something, you know, older than Christianity even, and that
yeah.
system has been there for a very long time in a sort of beautiful, productive polyculture.
I know. I know. And the monoculture that you said probably sounds like something Lucifer Morningstar would have done.
Oh no, who knows? I mean, I'm not sure where it came from. It's all over the earth, and many peoples have done it. And I don't know. It's good that people are figuring out how to be economically viable through polyculture, because I think that makes it so that each culture, each unique culture, you know, from Japan to India to the Maori of New Zealand to, you know, the indigenous Mayans in Guatemala to wherever people are, indigenously, they have a very excellent, beautiful connection to the horticulture, to the agriculture, to the animal agriculture in a place. And that is what really gets grown and expressed through regeneration. Regenerative agriculture will never look the same in two different places. It'll be totally
Right.
different. It'll be unique to the people. It'll be unique to the land. There'll be different foods and spices and flavors. There'll be different music that goes along with it. All of that really expresses, whereas in extractive agriculture, we get this homogenization. We get these straight lines. We get this, everything looks the same and everything matches the same certification standard. Regenerative
Right.
agriculture goes against that and creates something more beautiful and more delicious.
So now, focusing on your farm, High Falls Farm, as we are a business academy after all, we would like to briefly analyze the business model for this farm. So, on the lines of your key target customers and what are the main value drivers, what distribution strategy you use, and what are the challenges that you
Okay, yeah.
experience.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just briefly, it's a 30-acre farm, and there's about 16 acres in production. The main crop is apples, and we also have sheep that are not a major money maker for us. They're more for our personal consumption of the meat and the wool. We use the wool um, for felting and for spinning, and those sheep are part of the apple growing system. They graze underneath the apple trees and basically help the mowing while also fertilizing underneath the trees. So that's a special agroforestry system that's called a silvopasture, where we're using silvo meaning trees, and then pasture meaning, you know, the animals are grazing. So it's a tree pasture system that has many, many benefits for both the trees and for the animals. For example, we don't need to build them a barn or even have shelter in particular, because they have the trees to shelter under. Um, so those are some of the main crops. We also have a mushroom CSA, a shiitake mushroom CSA, where we use the wood that we cut out of our forests to use these logs, these a bit more than a meter long logs that we inoculate with mushrooms and then guide their fruiting so that we have a regular, consistent supply of very, very high quality, nutrient dense shiitake mushrooms throughout the year. So those are some of the main crops. Our main customers are all very local. We are not aiming for international or export. You know, it's relatively small scale of production. And so we're able to sell everything we produce to a very local area, to a couple different classes of customers. One is to repeat customers through the form of a community supported agriculture, where these customers commit at the beginning of the season, for example, with our shiitake mushroom CSA, community supported agriculture, they commit to buying a certain amount of mushrooms every week. and they pay us upfront at a slightly discounted price to help us with our upfront capital costs, but then they get a regular distribution every week throughout the season. At the same time, they're also sharing in the risk of our farming, because farming is risky. And so if we don't have as high production, we can't give them as much, then they understand that that's part of the risk they're taking in signing up with us for this community supported agriculture, CSA model. So that's one set. And then we have a lot of just direct customers. We have a informal email list and even texting relationships with customers where we say, okay, we're going to have a lot of this kind of apple. You know, do you want to buy a case of it in order to make cider, or store for the winter? So we just have a direct relationship with many local consumers, many local citizens who love the work that we're doing, who see the quality of what we're producing, even though we don't have any certifications. Though we probably will certify organic this year, more for the experience of it and doing it ourselves than the actual desire or need for it. And then our third kind of group of customers are the local restaurants. So we have several restaurants. There's 3, 4 restaurants within walking distance from our farm. And they love having extremely local fresh food to put on their menu. It's a premium item that they feature when we have the various things in season. And so those are more regular, consistent accounts that we can rely on to be purchasing a little bit larger volumes. And that's definitely part of the income streams for the farm. What were your other questions there?
So, what are the different challenges that you have faced so far that in your distribution strategy or in finding consumers, if there are any?
I wouldn't call it a challenge so much as it's taken work to build up our pool of customers. The farm, when we purchased the farm, it had a different sales and distribution model. It was a pick your own farm, and it had really been somewhat run down and a bit neglected over time. And so we stopped the pick your own. We want to manage and take care of the whole farm. And it's just taken some time to get out there. We go to our local food co-op where you can buy all sorts of food, where we do our shopping. And we did a couple events where we were there, with our apples or with our mushrooms, just talking to customers about them, presenting at various places, just getting the word out about our farm and what we're doing. And then also the relationships with restaurants, they just take time to build, right? We usually, to get a new restaurant account, we will go and show up there at the restaurant with our produce and give them a small little sample of our mushrooms or our apples and say, here, this is a little gift from us. Check it out, give it to the chef, see if you like it, and let us know if you'd be interested in more. And usually they'll, that first time they might buy a little bit, and then they see the response from their customers and they get back to us and they want more. So it takes time, and it takes, consistency of what we're producing in order to grow the relationships with the folks who are buying our food. So I would say it's kind of the main challenge, if there was one, is just putting in the time to build up the customers.
But that pays off in the long run, so it's good for you.
That's what we're hoping. I mean, we're still early. We bought an old farm with an old orchard, and part of what we're doing is restoring the orchard, which also in many cases means cutting down trees and planting new ones. So we're diversifying the crops. We're putting in different types of trees to have a more diverse yield over time and appeal to different markets. But when you're working with trees, which have a real great chance at storing carbon in the soil and biodiversity benefits, but they take a long time until you're getting fruit or nuts out of them.
Yeah.
So that, I think, if anything, would be a challenge, is the investment we have to make to get these new crops in the ground and then wait until they're producing. We can't actually sell them, until they're producing. So that would be a challenge with with an agroforestry, with a perennial tree crops orchard system, is the time between investment and sales.
Right. So are you diversifying into other crops, as in other than apples, or other varieties of apples?
Both. So we're grafting onto our existing trees many different varieties of apples. So when we got here, there were about 15 varieties on the farm, and now we have upwards of 75. And we're trying to add in 25 or 50 new varieties of apples every year. And part of the reason for that is so that we can have a biodiverse gene bank of different apples here, so we can see which ones work really well in our particular climate and soil. But then we're also planting mulberries. We're planting pawpaws, which are different than papayas, but pawpaws are a northern hardy relative in the Chirimoya family, so a very, very rich kind of tropical-like fruit, but that grows here where it gets, you know, -20 Fahrenheit, and you know, we have snow on the ground for 3 months, 3 or 4 months out of the year. We have several feet of snow on the ground. So we're also planting mulberries and chestnuts and hazelnuts. And then this year we'll be doing a number of medicinal herbs, perennial medicinal herbs that will sort of be in the ground in the understory. So they're using the same space as the orchard, but they're producing a different and sometimes faster yield than the tree crops themselves. Basically, we're trying to recreate the food forest from Kazakhstan on our farm here in New York.
Oh, nice, that's nice. And do you have any complementary partnerships that feed the success of your business?
Yeah, sort of like the enterprise ecosystem that we're building here. Well, there's kind of two layers of it. One, we have leased parts of our farm to other farmers. So we wanted a greater diversity of crops coming off. So we have leased one part of our land to an Asian vegetable CSA that is producing specialty Asian vegetables that you really can't get around here, and getting them to especially the Asian American community here in New York. And so they're growing vegetables on a scale that we never would on our own. And then we also lease land to a flower farmer who is growing beautiful cut flowers for weddings and celebrations and events, and also doing workshops. So she's educating people about growing flowers. So even on our farm, we have these different enterprises. This year, we're going to build a farm stand where all of us can kind of pitch in on the farm stand and sell all of our goods in one place. When we buy, for example, compost, or we buy fencing, we can pitch in on it and get it all together and share on delivery costs and you know, share resources in that way. We only had to put in one irrigation system, and that worked for all 3 farms. So, you know, having multiple enterprises on site is very useful. And then we also have sort of a wider enterprise ecosystem. I spoke about this a bit earlier, but the company that I work for doing research on sustainable agriculture and sustainable food products is right down the road. And so the researchers can have access to an actual working farm to learn about some of what they're researching and the products they're seeing in the market. They can come to the farm and actually see how it works at a real level. And then we also have a more local focused consulting company that helps other people develop regenerative agriculture systems in our region. And so that's a great partnership because you know, when people ask, you know, they're going to hire us for consulting to set up a regenerative farm, they sometimes will say, well, you know, how do you know this works? And we can say, oh, well, you can come visit the farm and actually see us. You know, I don't think we have it 100% figured out, but you know, here's the farm, and you can visit it and see how we're doing it. So that combined with, you know, we think of the restaurants and the food co-op and our customers all as part of our little local ecosystem that we're not just growing food for, but also helping people to change how they think about agriculture and its effect on the world.
That's great work that you're doing there, Ethan. So what would your advice be to entrepreneurs and investors who want to get into the fold of regenerative farming?
Okay, Well, I'll kind of go two different routes, one for entrepreneurs and one for investors. For entrepreneurs, I think that visiting working examples of regenerative agriculture is really, really important. You have to get there and experience it and listen to the farmer, whoever she is or whoever he is, and how they have figured out how to, move towards regeneration, and then also be holding these frameworks, right? The paradigms of agriculture, the levels of regenerative agriculture. Read the papers that have written about this, and hold those in your mind, and always be asking, how do I go even further than I have already gone? How can I evolve what I'm doing more than I already have? So yeah, I mean, I think the main advice for entrepreneurs is never stop learning, and don't be too quick to claim that what you're doing is regenerative. Don't be too quick to say, oh, I have a regenerative product, because it's likely that you don't. It takes a long time to develop the regenerative agriculture systems and then develop the whole system of creating a product before you can say, well, this is regenerative. And I don't even think, in a way, I think people should be telling the story of their products and the journey towards regeneration. But I don't think that claiming regenerative is especially at this point in time, really a particularly good thing to do. At the same time, we need innovation. We need innovators, especially at the farm level, to figure out what is going to be the appropriate regenerative agriculture approach in your particular climate, in your economic climate, in your region. Like I said, regenerative agriculture is going to look different in every place. And so you need to innovate and figure out what it is there based on the farm visits and the reading and learning you do wherever. And then on the investor side of things, my advice would be everything I just said for entrepreneurs, that holds true. Visit, learn, never stop and feel like, oh, I've got it, I'm regenerative now. But I think I would point you towards investing in agroforestry systems, investing in farms that have perennial tree crops, that are integrated, that are polycultures, that have animals, that are doing interesting things with water. Really look towards tree-based systems, because they have a much greater inherent chance of achieving regeneration than annual production, or animal-only agriculture, or row crop or tillage farming. Anything you can get to perennial systems, you're going to have a much better chance. And that also points to investing in real assets, so investing in land, and doing that carefully, doing that in a way that isn't land grabbing, that isn't extractive, but in a way that can support the growth of these long-term agroforestry systems.
Right. So, Ethan, that was a wonderful hour with you, with so much of learning. And here's my closing question to you. So, where can our audience find out more about you and your work and regenerative agriculture?
Well, I've given a lot of examples throughout. The main way to stay up to date with what I'm doing is you can sign up for the free Regeneration Newsroom, which is a monthly email publication where I do a roundup of all the big news in regenerative agriculture, regenerative business, and investing. So this is just a great way to keep on the pulse of what's happening. I've also started to share job listings. There's not a lot of jobs in regenerative agriculture yet, but there will be more and more. And so I've been asking people to send me, position openings where they want regenerative agriculture included as part of the job. And so I'm going to start including those in this sort of monthly newsroom that I go out. So that's just regenerationnewsroom.com. Another really good place for the business side of things, if you have a product-based business and you want, whether that's in fiber or food or medicine or supplements, if you want to be getting regenerative agriculture into your system of supply, then one of the companies that I helped found, which is called Terragenesis International, and we do basically international supply system consulting and project development. They are hosting a course. It might be too late by the time you hear this to get in on the first round, because I think it's actually filling up very quickly. It starts soon. but they're doing a regenerative supply course that's a online series of workshops. Actually, maybe it's even something that Agribusiness Academy wants to partner with them to do another round for your audience, if there's interest. But it's, yeah, a regenerative supply course from Terra Genesis International. And then maybe something on the investor side, if you're interested in investing in this, there's sort of two directions I would point you. One is an event called Transform that is happening in May in California in the United States, that's focused on regenerative agriculture and land transformation. And we just released a new list of funds, of investment funds that are working on regenerative agriculture and forestry. And so if you're an investor and you want to see, what's happening, we found there's already 24 billion invested into this direction. I think it's going to grow rapidly. So you can go to the Transform series website to get access to that list. And then, the event as well will be good. And then finally, I work with somebody who does a podcast that is really focused on the investment side. That's called Investing in Regenerative Agriculture podcast. And we do a sort of monthly version of the newsroom that I mentioned. So if you want just a quick, 15 or 20 minute sort of audio highlights from the newsroom, then you can get it there. And then there's, I don't know, I think he's got 45 interviews with great folks doing investment in regenerative agriculture, including a full hour with the project that I mentioned in India, in Andhra Pradesh. There's a full hour with Satya Tripathi, I think his name is, looking into that particular $2.3 billion project, bringing zero budget natural farming to a whole state in India. So that may be of interest. And then just all the stuff on that podcast, Investing in Regenerative Agriculture, is really good. Finally, if anyone wants to get in touch, I'm happy to share my email. Folks can email me directly and ask questions, or if I'm able to help, I will. I may be a little slow in response, but yeah, I'd welcome questions, project ideas, investment ideas. Be happy to connect.
Thank you so much for joining us, sharing your thoughts on regenerative farming, Ethan. We look forward to many such conversations. And thanks, Deborah, for all your valuable inputs.
Well, thank
Thanks
you,
to
and
the
thank you,
audience.
Ethan, for your energy. It was really inspiring.
Great,
Yeah.
glad to be here. Let me know when you want to come back. If you want to get even deeper and geekier on regenerative agriculture, I'd be happy to help.
We'd love to do that sometime. Yes. So thanks to our audience for tuning in for the podcast. We hope you enjoyed it and you have gained some food for thought. Follow us on LinkedIn and Facebook for updates on future podcasts and courses in food and agribusiness. And this is Chaitra Bharath signing off.